He was the one man everyone steered clear of, and he was the very one who saved her. Can you imagine that? Being admired by the whole town, yet feeling like nobody truly sees you until the most unlikely fella shows you the person you were always searching for. This story happened way back in 1928, in the countryside of a small village called St. Sebastian's Valley. Before we go any further, do us a favor and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. Your being here means the world to us and helps this channel grow, so we can keep bringing you more stories that stir the soul. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
Catherine Miller was 26 years old and, without a lick of doubt, the most looked-up-to young woman in all of St. Sebastian's Valley. As the daughter of Anthony Miller, the man who owned the main general store, she had grown up knowing just about every family in the whole region. Her father was a good man, an honest worker who had built his business from the ground up over 30 long years. The store stood right in the heart of the village, a sturdy building with thick walls and big windows that let the golden afternoon sun pour in. You could find anything there, from flour and sugar to fancy fabrics from far away and tools for the farm. It was the natural gathering spot, a place where news traveled just as fast as the goods sold. Catherine had been helping her daddy since she was just a little girl. She knew every customer's name, the story of every family, and she remembered the little things that made people feel like they mattered. When Mrs. Irene came in looking for embroidery thread, Catherine was already setting aside the exact shade of blue she favored. When Mr. Boniface stopped by for his tobacco, she would ask after his wife, who was getting over a bad case of the flu. They were simple things, but they came from the heart. Catherine genuinely cared. Her warm and thoughtful way was not for show. It was just who she was. And on top of that, it was mighty hard not to notice her beauty. She had long brown hair that shimmered like honey in the sunlight, amber eyes full of human kindness, and a smile that could brighten up the gloomiest day. She did not need fancy dresses or expensive jewels. She wore plain clothes, but they were always spotless and well-tended. Even so, or maybe because of it, she turned heads wherever she went. Men would stop and stare when she walked down the street. Conversations would hush when she walked into church on Sundays. You could almost hear the sighs that followed in her wake, but all that constant admiration had started to feel like a heavy weight on her shoulders. Catherine had lost track of how many young men had shown up at the store, asking her father for his blessing to court her. They all sang the same old tune, that she was the prettiest girl they had ever laid eyes on, that she would make a perfect wife, that they would move heaven and earth for her. They were pretty words, all right, but they were empty. Not a single one of them asked what she liked to do. None of them cared to know what she thought about things. They wanted to show her off, not get to know her. They wanted the beautiful Catherine on their arm like a man wants a fine painting hanging on his wall. There was the judge's son, a handsome fellow who talked a big game about politics and the grand future he had planned, but he never once asked about her own dreams. There was the nephew of that rich rancher from over Santa Ita way, who rode in on a purebred horse and made sure to mention the size of his family's land 3 times in one conversation. There was even the new school teacher, an educated man who could quote French poets, but he looked at Catherine the way you admire a statue in a museum, lovely but distant, something to be looked at. Catherine turned them all down, polite as could be. Her mother, Mrs. Amelia, was beginning to get a little worried. Not that she ever pushed her daughter, but she would make those gentle comments that mothers do, that Catherine was already 26, that good men do not come along every day, that she was getting to be too particular. Her father was more understanding, always saying his girl would marry when she found a man who deserved her. But even he would sometimes give her a puzzled look, like he could not quite figure out what she was waiting for. The truth was, Catherine could not rightly explain it herself. She just felt deep down in her bones, that she wanted to be loved for who she was, not just for what she looked like. She longed for someone who saw beyond her pretty face, someone real and true, who did not feel the need to impress her with what he owned or with words he had practiced. She wanted a man whose actions spoke louder than his promises. While Catherine was surrounded by attention she never wanted, on the complete other side of things, there was a man who lived in the deepest kind of lonesomeness. Vincent Drummond was the owner of Wild Ridge Farm, a good-sized piece of land about 6 miles from town, tucked into the hills that gave the place its name. The farm had belonged to his father, a hard man who had passed on 8 years before, leaving everything he had to his only son. Vincent had worked that land all by himself ever since. His reputation in the village was just awful. They said he was a dangerous man with a fearsome temper, that nobody could work for him because he was impossible to be around. They said he lived like a wild creature, that he would go for months without ever coming down to the village, and that when he did show up, it was only to sell some cattle and buy what he needed before vanishing again. They even whispered in hushed tones that he was hiding some terrible secret up there on that ridge, something that would explain why he chose to live that way. Vincent came down to St. Sebastian's Valley maybe once a month, always by himself, always on the back of the same chestnut horse with a dark mane. He would get there in the early morning, take care of his business with a quiet quickness, and be gone before noon. He did not say howdy to anyone unless he absolutely had to. He did not stop to chat. He did not smile. When he walked into Anthony Miller's store to get his supplies, he would leave a written list on the counter, wait in silence while they gathered his things, pay the exact amount, and leave with a little nod that you could barely call a goodbye. People would literally move out of his way when he passed. Mothers would pull their children close as if just his shadow could bring them harm. Men would look anywhere but at him. Kids would point and whisper until an adult shushed them. Vincent paid it all no mind. His face was always the same, closed off like a locked gate, his jaw set firm, his eyes looking at something far away. He wore simple work clothes, a wide-brimmed hat that hid half his face, and boots that were worn from hard use. Catherine had seen him a few times over the years, always just a quick glance. He had never come into the store when she was working the counter, almost as if he was avoiding even the chance of talking to her. She had heard the stories, of course. The whole village talked about him. But Catherine had learned a long time ago not to put too much stock in gossip. Folks sure loved to turn what they did not understand into a monster. It was on a March afternoon that their paths finally crossed for real. Catherine had gone to visit Mrs. Lucinda, an old family friend who lived on a small farm about an hour's ride from the village. The visit had been real pleasant, full of tea and good conversation. Mrs. Lucinda was feeling a bit better from the arthritis that plagued her, and Catherine had brought her a salve her mother made with herbs. They ended up talking longer than they meant to, and when Catherine finally said her goodbyes, the sun was already starting to dip down low. She was driving the small wagon her father had lent her, pulled by Star, a sweet-natured mare who knew the way home by heart. The sky had been heavy all morning, with dark, lead-colored clouds that promised a good storm. But Catherine figured she could make it back before the rain started. She was wrong. With about half an hour of road still ahead of her, the first drops began to fall. In just a few minutes, it turned into a downpour. The rain came down hard and mean, one of those March storms that turns dirt roads into rivers and the whole world into a gray haze. Catherine could barely see 6 feet in front of her. Star plodded forward, skittish from the thunder that was cracking open the sky. Catherine held the reins tight, soaked to the bone, trying to keep her wits about her, even as her heart hammered in her chest. Her big mistake was trying to cross the creek. On a normal day, that creek was just a little trickle of clear water that flowed over smooth stones, so shallow it would not even get the bottoms of your boots wet. But with that driving rain, it had turned into a raging brown current, much wider and deeper than usual. Catherine paused on the bank. The bridge was further up the road, but taking that detour would add nearly an hour to her trip. She was drenched, shivering with cold, and just desperate to get home. She thought she could get across real quick. Star stepped into the water. The first few steps were steady enough, but right in the middle, where the water came up to the mare's chest, a stronger wave hit them from the side. The wagon lurched something awful. A wheel dropped into a hole hidden beneath the muddy water. It all happened in a blink. The wagon tipped over. Catherine was thrown into the freezing, furious water. The cold shock knocked the wind right out of her. The current pulled at her with a terrifying strength. Catherine tried to get her feet under her, but she could not find the bottom. She tried to swim, but the water just tumbled her over and over, turning her all around. She swallowed water, coughed, and screamed for help. She knew nobody could hear her. Her heavy skirts were pulling her down. Panic took hold. She was going to die right there, drowned in a creek she had known her whole life, just a few miles from her own home. That is when a strong hand grabbed a hold of her arm. Catherine did not even see where he came from. All of a sudden, there was a man in the water with her, tall and solid as a rock, holding her with a power that left no room for argument. He pulled her up against his chest. A powerful voice rumbled right next to her ear, telling her not to struggle. Catherine went still, letting instinct take over. The man hauled her through the churning water with a will made of iron. Every step he took was solid and sure, his muscles straining against his drenched shirt. He never once wavered, never lost his footing. They finally made it to the bank. He set her down on the soaked grass with a gentleness that seemed impossible after the raw strength he had just shown. Catherine dropped to her knees, hacking up water, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a storm. The rain and her own fear blurred everything. It took a long moment for her vision to clear. When she finally looked up, she saw the face of the man who saved her. It was Vincent Drummond. He was kneeling there beside her, his black hair stuck to his forehead, rain pouring down his sharp-featured face. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they burned with an intensity that seemed to push back the storm itself. Vincent asked if she was hurt. His voice was deep and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed, but she could hear real concern in it. Catherine just shook her head, unable to find her voice. He gave her a quick professional once-over, like a man used to checking livestock for injuries. He seemed to find no broken bones. Vincent shrugged off the heavy leather coat he was wearing, which was still mostly dry inside, and draped it over her shoulders. The movement was fast, almost rough, but it was thoughtful. Catherine could feel the lingering warmth of his body in the leather, the smell of hard work and rich earth, and something else she could not name that was purely him. Vincent said they had to get out of the rain. She started to argue, to say she needed to find her wagon, to look for Star, but he was already pulling her to her feet. There was a little building not far off, a tool shed some farmer had put up by the road. Vincent led her toward it, his hand firm on her elbow, guiding but not forcing her. The inside smelled like damp wood and soil. It was not much, but it was a roof over their heads. Vincent struck a match and found an old lantern hanging on the wall. The dim yellow light turned the tiny shed into a safe little haven from the wildness outside. Catherine finally found her voice, though it came out shaky. She tried to thank him. Vincent cut her off with a simple gesture of his hand, saying it was not necessary. She insisted, asking what his name was. He paused for a long moment, as if telling her was giving up something important. At last he said, "Vincent Drummond." The name hit Catherine like a jolt. So this was the hard-faced rancher, the man the whole town was scared of, the very same man who had just thrown himself into danger to save her without a second thought. She told him her name, Catherine Miller. Vincent gave a small nod, like he already knew. Of course he knew, she realized. In a town this small, everybody knew everybody, even if they never spoke a word. A peculiar silence settled between them, broken only by the hard drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Vincent kept his eyes away from her. He stood over by the door, looking like he was ready to bolt the second she did not need him anymore. Catherine realized she was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the terror that was just now catching up to her. She had nearly died. If Vincent had not shown up, she would have drowned for sure. The truth of it landed on her like a physical blow. Tears started to fall without her permission, mixing with the rain still dripping from her hair. She tried to hide her face, feeling ashamed of her weakness, but her choked sobs gave her away. Vincent came closer, looking awkward and out of his element. He was clearly not a man who was used to dealing with crying women. He just stood there for a moment, torn between wanting to help and wanting to keep his distance. Finally, in a stiff motion, he sat down on an old crate that was being used as a bench. He kept a respectful space between them, but his quiet company was a comfort. His presence was just solid, dependable. He did not ask for anything. After a few minutes, Catherine got a hold of herself. She scrubbed her face with the back of her hand and took a deep, shaky breath. She apologized for being so weak. Vincent told her it was not weakness. It was just what happens when you almost die. His voice was softer than she would have expected. He added that she had been brave out there in the water, that most folks would have panicked completely. Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him, without all the town gossip clouding her view. Vincent was a tall man with the wide shoulders of someone who put in a long day's work every day. He was probably around 30 years old, maybe a little older. He had a strong, angular face, a square jaw covered in a few days of stubble, and a nose that looked like it had been broken once. He was not handsome in a classic way, but there was something that drew you to him. It was the fire in his eyes, the sureness in how he moved, the way he used so few words that every one of them mattered more. She tried to make conversation, asking if he was on his way home from the farm when he saw her. Vincent grunted a yes. She asked if he lived up there all by himself. He did it again. She tried a different way, saying she had never been up to Wild Ridge, but folks said it was a beautiful piece of land. Vincent just said it was a farm, same as any other. It was clear he was not one for small talk. But Catherine understood something important in that moment. Vincent was not mean or cruel or dangerous. He was just quiet. He kept to himself for sure, but he was not a threat. There was a deep well of kindness in him, hidden underneath that silent shell. She had seen it when he gave her his coat, when he lit the lantern to give them light and comfort, and when he sat with her in the silence, just to be there. The rain finally started to let up, going from a downpour to a steady drizzle. Vincent got to his feet and said he was going to see if he could get the wagon out and find the mare. Catherine wanted to go with him, but he told her no, his voice firm. He ordered her to stay put, where it was warm and dry. Before she could even argue, he was gone. Catherine was left alone in the little shed, wrapped in his coat that smelled of a good man and honest work. Her thoughts were spinning. Vincent Drummond was not at all like people said he was. He was a quiet hero, a man of actions instead of words, a man who saved a total stranger without ever expecting a thank you. He had not asked who she was before he jumped in that water. He had not cared if she was pretty or what her family name was. He just saw a person in trouble, and he acted. Vincent came back 20 minutes later. He was leading Star by the halter. The mare was soaked, but perfectly fine. The wagon was beat up, but he had managed to get it turned back over and pull it from the creek. It could be fixed, not today, but it was not a total loss. He told her all this in a few short, direct sentences. Catherine tried to thank him again, this time with more feeling. Vincent just gave her a nod, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. He offered to take her back to the village. His own horse was tied up nearby, a big, powerful animal that could easily carry both of them. Catherine said yes, not because she could not ride Star by herself, but because she knew this might be the only chance she had to spend more time with him. Vincent helped her get on the horse first, then swung up behind her with the easy grace of a man born in a saddle. He kept his distance as best he could, but it was impossible not to be close. Catherine could feel the solid warmth of his body against her back, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, and could feel the sense of safety that just seemed to roll off of him. The ride back to town was quiet. Vincent guided the horse with a sure hand, picking his way around the worst of the mud holes. Star followed along behind them on a lead rope. The drizzle kept on, making the world around them a soft, blurry painting of greens and grays. Catherine tried to start a conversation a couple of times, mentioning how fierce the storm had been. Vincent just made a sound of agreement. She said she was mighty lucky he happened to be passing by. Vincent told her luck was a strong word. He said he took that road every time he came down from his farm. She asked if he came down often. Vincent replied, not much. It was like trying to have a conversation with a stone wall. But Catherine did not mind one bit. There was something peaceful about his quietness. It was not an awkward or unfriendly silence. It was just silence. Vincent did not see the need to fill the air with useless words, and after dealing with the constant chatter of admirers who never... The ride back was quiet, but it was not an awkward kind of quiet. It was peaceful, and after the storm's fury, Catherine found she liked it. They were nearing town just as the sun was dipping low, and folks were lighting their lamps, making the windows glow a warm yellow. Vincent pulled his horse up right in front of Anthony Miller's general store. He swung down from the saddle first, then reached up a hand to Catherine. She took it, feeling the rough, steady strength in that big hand. The second her boots hit the dusty street, she tried again to find the right words. She told him he had saved her, plain and simple, and she did not know how she could ever make it right, but she truly wanted to try. That is when Vincent finally looked her square in the eye. There was a fire in his gaze that sent a shiver through her, and it had nothing to do with being cold or scared. He just said he did not need anything. Said any decent man would have done the same. Catherine shook her head. No, she said, not just anyone would have risked their own skin like you did. He did not have a comeback for that. Just then the store door flew open and Anthony Miller came rushing out, his face a mask of worry. Catherine! He had been nearly frantic, wondering where she had gotten to in that gully washer. Mrs. Amelia was right on his heels, looking just as distressed. Catherine started to tell them what happened, but her mother cut her off, already pulling her toward the door, fussing about her wet dress and the fear of her catching pneumonia. When Catherine glanced over her shoulder to wave goodbye to Vincent, he was already swinging back up onto his horse. It was only then that Anthony Miller seemed to recognize who had brought his daughter home. His whole expression changed, a mix of surprise and a good bit of caution. Vincent Drummond, he greeted, his voice all formal. Vincent just tipped his head. It was barely a nod. Anthony asked him to explain. Vincent laid it out in 3 short sentences. The young lady's wagon went into the creek. He got her out of the water and brought her on home. That was all. Anthony started to say his thanks, but Vincent was already turning that horse around. He mentioned the wagon was under a lean-to down by the creek, and that someone ought to fetch it come morning. And with that, he was gone, leaving no room for another word. Folks on the street had stopped in their tracks to watch the whole thing, already whispering to each other. Vincent Drummond and pretty Catherine Miller. Now that was a pair you would not expect. The town's rumor mill would be working overtime before breakfast. Back inside, Catherine changed into dry clothes while her mother got a hot bath ready and put the kettle on for tea. She recounted the whole tale, from her foolish choice to try and cross the swollen creek to the moment Vincent pulled her out. Mrs. Amelia listened with a hand pressed to her heart, pale as a sheet, thinking how close she had come to losing her only girl. Anthony. He just listened, quiet, and thinking hard, when Catherine mentioned how kind and attentive Vincent had been, how he had wrapped his own heavy coat around her to stop the shivering, lit a lantern, and just sat with her while the storm blew itself out. Anthony and Amelia shared a look, a heavy one. Catherine saw it and asked what they were thinking. Her father hesitated for a moment. He finally said he was mighty grateful to Vincent for what he did, but that he did not really know the man. Said nobody in town did. The man had kept to himself for years out on his ranch, did not socialize, and had a reputation for being a hard man to get along with. A little spark of anger flared up in Catherine. Hard, she repeated. The man just saved my life and did not think twice about it. He did not ask for a single thing. He sure did not seem hard to her. He seemed like a good man, a truer man than all those slick talkers who showed up at her door with sweet nothings on their tongues. Mrs. Amelia started to say something about not judging a book by its cover, but Catherine cut her short. She said that is exactly what she was doing, judging him by what he did, not by what folks whispered. They let the topic drop, but Catherine could not get it out of her head. Later that night, tucked under a pile of warm quilts, she played it all back in her mind. The power in his hands as he hauled her from that rushing water, the dark fire in his eyes, his low voice telling her she was brave, the easy quiet on the ride home, and most of all, that last look he gave her before riding off, charged with something she could not quite put a name to, but that made her heart do a little flip. Vincent Drummond was not the man people painted him out to be, and Catherine decided then and there she wanted to know the real story. The next few days were peculiar. Word of the rescue traveled through town faster than a prairie fire, and the story got bigger and wilder with every telling. Some folks claimed Catherine was a breath away from death. Others swore Vincent had to fight the current for 100 yards with her in his arms. One person even started a rumor that he had used his lariat to rope her out of the creek, which was just plain ridiculous. But then gossip does not need to make sense to spread. The town was split right down the middle. A few folks were impressed with Vincent's bravery, saying maybe they had him wrong all this time. But others got suspicious, wondering out loud how it was he just happened to be right there at the perfect time, as if he had planned it. And a whole lot of people just did not know what to make of it all. Vincent Drummond was still a puzzle nobody in town could solve. As for Catherine, well, she had more eyes on her than ever before. People would find any excuse to come into the store just hoping to hear the story from her. The women folk would ask all sorts of nosy questions about what it was like being so near that mysterious rancher. The men, especially the ones she had turned down, would make snide remarks about how she was lucky anyone saved her, even if it had to be Vincent Drummond. She heard the sneer in their voices loud and clear. John Thatcher, the blacksmith's son and the one who would not take no for an answer, was the worst of the lot. He came into the store 2 days later and made sure to talk loud enough for everyone to hear him. He said it was a real shame a fine lady like Catherine had to be indebted to a fellow like Vincent Drummond. Then he added that she had best be careful about the kind of thanks a lonely man like that might expect. That did it. Catherine felt a hot anger rise up in her. She walked right up to John, and the look on her face made him take a nervous step back. In a voice that was quiet but sharp as a needle, she told him that Vincent expected nothing, that he was a good man who had saved her, and that John ought to be ashamed of himself for trying to drag an honorable man's name through the mud. You could have heard a pin drop in that store. John turned beet red, spun on his heel, and stomped right out. Well, that gave the gossips something new to chew on. Catherine Miller standing up for Vincent Drummond. Interesting. Catherine knew then she had to thank him the right way. Vincent's coat was still at her house, all dry and neatly folded. That would be her reason. She spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen baking. She made coconut macaroons, buttery shortbread, and sweet pumpkin cookies. She packed them all up nicely in a basket with a clean linen cloth, placed the coat on top, and announced she was heading out to Wild Ridge Ranch to return the clothes and give him a proper thank you. Mrs. Amelia started protesting right away. It just was not proper for a young, unmarried woman to go calling on a single man at his secluded ranch. What on earth would people say? Catherine just told her that folks were already talking up a storm, so it did not much matter. She was not going to do anything wrong, just give the man the thanks he deserved. Her father stepped in then. He said if Catherine had her mind set on it, he would ride along with her. Catherine agreed, knowing that was the best deal she was going to get. The ride to Wild Ridge Ranch took a good 2 hours. The trail wound up into the hills through thick stands of pine trees and across wide-open pastures where cattle were grazing. Catherine had to admit it was a beautiful piece of country. The air was clean, and the only sounds were the birds and the wind. It felt spacious and free, a feeling you just could not get in town. She could see why a man might choose to live out here. The property itself was surprisingly well cared for. For some reason, she had pictured a run-down place, matching the owner's lonesome reputation. But the fences were strong, the pastures were clean, and the main house, built of solid wood and stone, looked sturdy. It was not some fancy mansion, just a good, functional building. There were tool sheds, a solid corral, and even a little vegetable patch off to the side. Everything indicated that a man who knew what he was doing was running the show. Vincent was out by the corral when they pulled up, mending a fence. His back was to them, but he heard the wagon wheels and turned around. For just a split second, Catherine saw a real surprise on his face before that plain, unreadable expression took over again. He set down his tools and walked over, his stride steady and unhurried. He gave a formal greeting to Anthony, then his eyes landed on Catherine, and they held a silent question. Catherine hopped down from the wagon with her basket. She explained she had brought back his coat and wanted to thank him the right way. She held out the basket, telling him she had baked some things as a small token of her thanks. Vincent looked hesitant for a long moment. It seemed like he might just say no, but then he reached out and took the basket gently, almost like he had forgotten what it felt like to be given a gift. He said it was not necessary, but he thanked her with a short nod. An awkward quiet settled over them. Anthony tried to break it by making small talk about the ranch, saying how good everything looked. Vincent's answers were short. Yes, he ran the place himself. No, it was not too hard once you got a routine. Yes, the cattle were healthy this year. The conversation just sputtered out after each exchange. Catherine watched Vincent the whole time. He made a point of not looking right at her, keeping his gaze on her father. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the obvious discomfort with the social situation. But she noticed details others would not notice, like how his fingers held the basket so carefully, making sure not to crush the sweets inside. She saw the quick glance he sent her way when he thought she was not looking. She noticed how the tension in his jaw softened just a little when she smiled. Anthony finally spoke up, saying they did not want to take up any more of his time and had just come to drop off the delivery. Vincent thanked them once more for the food, saying they did not need to go to all that trouble. Catherine said it was her pleasure and that she hoped he enjoyed them. For a short but powerful moment, their eyes locked. Something real passed between them, a small but certain spark. Vincent was the first to look away, taking a small step back. As they were climbing back onto the wagon to head home, Catherine could not help herself. She turned and asked if Vincent planned on coming down to the village in the next few days. He seemed taken aback by the question, but said maybe toward the end of the week. She told him it would be nice to see him, that she would like to talk some more if he had the time. Vincent did not reply. He just stood there, holding the basket of sweets with an unreadable look on his face as they rode away. On the ride back, Anthony was quiet for a good long while. He finally said, choosing his words with care, that Vincent seemed like a good, hard-working man. He said the farm was well kept, which spoke volumes about his character. But, he added, Vincent was a very private man, very much a loner, and that Catherine ought to be careful. Careful of what? She asked him. Anthony paused for a moment. Careful with her expectations, he answered, not saying what he truly meant. Catherine understood exactly what her father was leaving unsaid. He had seen her interest, and it had him worried. Vincent Drummond was not what you would call a suitable match. He had no social life to speak of, no friends in the town, and showed zero interest in making any connections. He was a man who had chosen to be alone. Anthony was afraid his daughter would get her heart broken trying to reach a man who did not want to be reached. But Catherine could not stop thinking about that last look they had shared. There was something there. She was sure of it. Something buried deep beneath all that quiet reserve. Vincent was not a man without feelings. She had seen it with her own 2 eyes. She had seen true concern when he pulled her from that river. She had seen kindness when he gave her his coat. She had even seen something like warmth in his dark eyes when she smiled at him earlier that day. It was buried way down, shielded by years of living on his own. But it was there. And Catherine, for the very first time in her life, felt a true connection with someone. It was not a shallow admiration based on looks, nor a calculated interest based on what was convenient. It was a deep kind of recognition, as if a part of her soul recognized a part of his and answered the call. It was a brand new feeling, both frightening and thrilling. She made up her mind right then and there on the ride back home, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, that she was not going to give up. Vincent Drummond deserved to be truly known. He deserved to have someone see past the false reputation, and Catherine wanted to be that person. The days that followed were a true test of her patience. Catherine waited for the weekend, hoping Vincent would actually come down to the village, like he said he might. She found herself peering out the store window every time she heard the sound of horse hooves on the road. Her mother noticed, of course, giving her those knowing looks but saying nothing. John Thatcher showed up again, trying to pick up his courting where he left off, but Catherine shut him down so coldly that he finally seemed to get the hint and stopped coming around. Saturday finally came. Catherine woke up earlier than usual, helped open the store, and kept a watchful eye all day. The day dragged on, with every hour feeling like it was 3. She started to think Vincent was not coming, that maybe he had changed his mind, or that his maybe was just a polite way of saying no. It was already starting to get dark when she overheard Mrs. Matilda telling another customer she had seen Vincent Drummond leaving old Gonzalo's warehouse with sacks of feed. Catherine's heart started to pound. He was in the village. She waited, trying her best to look casual while she went about her work. A few minutes later, the store's front door creaked open. Vincent walked in and stopped for a second when he saw her. A flash of surprise crossed his face before his usual neutral expression returned. Catherine smiled, feeling a flutter in her stomach, which was a completely new experience for her. "It is good to see you," she said, hoping her voice sounded steady. Vincent just nodded and mumbled a quiet hello. He had his usual written list, but this time, instead of just setting it on the counter and waiting, he handed it directly to Catherine. Their fingers brushed for just a second. Catherine seized the opportunity, mentioning that she hoped he had enjoyed the sweets. Vincent confirmed that he had, that they were good. She asked him which one was his favorite. He paused, clearly not used to the conversation, but then he answered that it was the coconut macaroons. It was not much, but it was a start. Catherine used every moment while she gathered the items on his list to ask simple questions. How were his cattle doing? Had he finished fixing that fence? Had the weather let up enough for him to get his work done? Vincent answered in short sentences, but he did answer. He did not run away. And then Catherine realized something important. He did not seem annoyed, just not used to it. When she finished gathering everything and he paid, she took a chance. She said her father had mentioned how well he kept his farm, and that it was impressive he managed it all by himself. Vincent offered something that was almost a smile, a little crooked and small, but it was definitely a smile. He said it was honest work. She agreed, adding that honest work says a lot about a man. There was a moment of silence. Vincent picked up his packages but did not leave right away. He lingered for an extra second as if he wanted to say something but could not find the words. Finally, he just mumbled, "Thank you." It was not just for the supplies, but for seeing him. He added that he was not used to that. Catherine replied that he should be, that he had done an amazing thing by saving her. Vincent shook his head, saying he just did what was right. And there it was again, that raw honesty, that inability to take any credit, that complete genuineness that all her polite and scheming suitors lacked. Catherine held his gaze for a long moment. This time Vincent did not look away. Something was growing between them, fragile but real. Then he blinked, breaking the connection. He murmured a goodbye and walked out. Catherine stood there, her heart beating fast, a smile on her face that she could not control. Mrs. Matilda, who had been watching the entire exchange with great interest, commented just loud enough for everyone to hear that this was quite an interesting turn of events. Catherine paid her no mind. She did not care about town gossip. For the first time in her 26 years, she felt that spark people always talked about when it came to true love. And she was not about to let it go. Vincent Drummond might not know it yet, but she was determined to get to know him, to understand him, and to show him that he deserved to be seen. He deserved connection, warmth, and maybe even love. And Catherine, the kind woman everyone admired but nobody truly knew, had finally found someone worth the effort. The greatest love story was just getting started. The weeks that followed brought a quiet change. Catherine did not make a big show of it or announce her plans to anyone. Instead, she began to build a connection with a patience that would have shocked anyone who only knew her on the surface. She understood that Vincent was not a man who would be won over by bold moves or dramatic gestures. He was like a fortress, built stone by stone over many years, and he could only be reached in that same way. slowly with respect, proving that her presence was not a threat. Vincent started coming down to the village a little more often. It was not every week, but maybe every 10 days or so, sometimes even sooner. He always came to the miller's store for his supplies, and he always found Catherine at the counter, as if she had developed a sixth sense that told her exactly when he would show up. And every single time they would exchange a few more words than were absolutely necessary for a simple purchase. They were small talks, little pieces of conversation that anyone else might have thought were nothing. Catherine would ask about the farm, and Vincent would answer with few but honest details. He mentioned that winter seemed to be coming early this year. She commented that her mother was putting up extra preserves. He said one of his horses was limping. She suggested an herbal tea her father used for swelling. They were simple conversations, but each one was like laying another brick on the bridge between their two very different worlds. And then there were the moments, those quiet seconds that said more than any words could. It was when Vincent would hand her the money to pay, and his fingers would brush against hers, staying there for just a fraction of a second too long. It was when Catherine would laugh at something, and the hardness in Vincent's eyes would soften, as if he were almost smiling. It was when she would catch him looking at her while she gathered his goods, and he would quickly look away, but not quite fast enough. It was when he would first walk in, and before even saying hello, his eyes would search for her, as if he needed to make sure she was there. The village noticed, of course. St. Sebastian's Valley was far too small for secrets. The gossips got to work right away. They said Catherine was lowering herself, wasting her good looks on a man who barely knew how to speak. They said Vincent was just taking advantage of her being grateful for the rescue. They said it was just a phase, that soon Catherine would come to her senses and marry one of the more suitable men who were pursuing her. But Catherine did not come to her senses. In fact, she walked even further down that path that only she seemed to see. She began appearing in places she knew Vincent was likely to be. If he headed to old Gonzalo's warehouse, well, she just happened to be looking at fabrics in the shop next door. When he made a stop at the blacksmith to order horseshoes, she'd turn up with a basket of bread her mother sent for the blacksmith's wife. She never crowded him, and she wasn't too obvious about it. It was just a steady, gentle presence that kept circling near him. At first, Vincent was just plain confused by it all. He wasn't accustomed to anyone seeking him out or wanting his company. The first few times Catherine popped up out of nowhere, he tensed up something fierce, almost defensive, like a wild animal that's used to its solitude, and suddenly finds another creature in its territory. But she never pushed. She would greet him, give him a smile, share a few light words, and then be on her way. She wasn't demanding his time, just offering a little bit of hers. It was one morning in May, when the air had a real bite to it, that things finally started to change. Catherine was on her way back from visiting Mrs. Lucinda, taking the very same road where he had saved her all those months ago. This time there was no storm. It was just a clear, cold morning with frost covering the fields like a dusting of sugar. She saw Vincent up ahead, all by himself, mending a fence by the road with that focused way he had. Catherine pulled the wagon to a stop. Vincent heard the quiet and looked over, a flicker of surprise on his face. She climbed down with a basket. Her mama always packed when she went visiting, and she walked right over to him. "I brought some hot coffee and bread that's still warm," she said with a smile. "I figured you might want to warm up some." Vincent just stood there for a second, tools in hand, looking like he was torn between taking her kindness and keeping his distance. Kindness won out. They sat down together on a big rock near the fence line. Vincent drank his coffee without saying a word, but Catherine caught the tiny little sigh of comfort as the hot liquid went down his throat. She didn't try to fill the quiet with a bunch of chatter. She just sat there with him, enjoying the crisp morning, the clean air, and the sight of the hills off in the distance. It was Vincent who broke the silence. He thanked her for the coffee and said it was good. She just smiled and told him the cold was asking for it. Then he looked at her, and with a tone that said the question had been on his mind for a long while, he asked, "Why are you doing this?" Catherine knew exactly what he was really asking. "Why do I look for you? Why do I keep trying when anybody else would have already quit?" She took a moment before she answered. She told him that he was a mystery to her, that she saw a goodness in him that other folks missed. She said he saved her life and never asked for a single thing in return, and that one act told her more about his character than years of shallow talk could ever tell her about other men. Vincent was quiet for a long time, just staring down at the coffee cup held in his rough, calloused hands. At last he spoke, his voice lower than usual, saying that she didn't know the first thing about him, that folks had good reasons for keeping him at arm's length. Catherine replied that if that was true, then he ought to tell her himself. She wanted to get to know the real man, not the one from town gossip. Vincent finally lifted his head and met her gaze. She could see an old hurt in his eyes, a pain he had carried for so long it had become a part of who he was. And then, maybe because the chill in the air called for some human warmth, or maybe because the weight of all those years of silence was just too much to bear alone, Vincent started to talk. He explained that it wasn't some dark secret that kept him isolated. There was no big betrayal or terrible tragedy in his past. It was something slower, something that ate at you over time. He had always been a quiet man, more at home with hard work than with socializing. Even as a boy, he preferred the company of animals and the land over people. When his father passed and left him the farm, Vincent was 26. He tried for a while to be part of the village life. He went to the socials, the dances, and the church gatherings, but he never seemed to fit. He just didn't know how to talk about the things they talked about. He didn't get all the unspoken rules of how people were supposed to act. He was too blunt, too serious, and way too quiet. The young women steered clear of him because he didn't know how to give fancy compliments. The other men thought he was odd because he'd rather leave early than stay up drinking and telling tall tales all night. The whispers started soon after. People said he was unfriendly, that he was arrogant, that he thought he was better than everyone else. Some even said there was just something wrong with him. Vincent tried to pay it no mind at first, but it was like a slow acid drip, eating away at him. Every sideways glance, every conversation that died down when he walked near, every invitation he never got. He came to realize that folks weren't judging him for what he did, but for what he didn't do, for not smiling enough, not talking enough, for just being different. The final straw had come years back when he tried to court a young lady. Vincent never said her name, and Catherine knew better than to ask. He told her he thought she was different, that she understood him. He spent months working up the courage to speak to her father, to ask for permission to officially call on her. When he finally did it, the girl's father laughed. He laughed right in Vincent's face. He said his daughter deserved a man with a future, with some ambition, not some hermit farmer who could barely string two civil words together. He told Vincent he should be ashamed for even thinking he was a worthy match. Vincent never tried again. He decided right then and there that if people didn't want him, well then, he sure as heck didn't need them. He went back out to Wild Ridge Farm, and he stayed there. He built a life that didn't need anyone's approval or acceptance. He worked the land hard, he took care of his stock, he sold his cattle, bought what he needed, and went right back to his chosen solitude. It was a lonely life, he told her, but at least it was an honest one. He never had to pretend to be something he wasn't. He didn't have to put up with judging eyes or nasty whispers. When he was done talking, the air felt heavy. Catherine felt a fire burning in her chest. She was angry at the thoughtless cruelty of people, at how they had judged a good man just because he wasn't like them. She told him, her voice thick with emotion, that man was a dang fool. She said there was nothing wrong with Vincent for being quiet. He was genuine, and she'd take one man of honest deeds over 100 men with empty words any day of the week. Vincent just watched her with a look Catherine couldn't quite figure out. There was surprise in his eyes, sure, but there was something else, something deeper. Maybe it was vulnerability, like her words had reached a place he kept locked up tight. He asked her why she was so different from everybody else, why she didn't see him the way they all did. Catherine answered that maybe it was because she had also spent her life being seen the wrong way. She said folks looked at her and only saw a pretty face. They wanted to own her like she was some fancy decoration. Not a single one of them cared about what she thought, or dreamed, or felt. Vincent was the first man who seemed completely uninterested in her looks, and ironically, that made him more interesting to her than all the others combined. In that moment, there was a powerful connection between them. It was silent, but it was strong. They were two people who had been misunderstood for opposite reasons, and they finally found someone who saw them for who they really were. Vincent said almost in a whisper that she deserved better than a hermit farmer with a ruined name. Catherine gave him a sad but determined smile and said she'd be the one to decide what she deserved. Thank you so much. If this story about true love is pulling at your heartstrings, how about you give us a like and subscribe to the channel? You won't want to miss how this all turns out. They both went on their way that day, but something had changed for good. The wall between them hadn't come tumbling down, not completely, but it had a big crack in it now, and through that crack a little bit of light was starting to shine through. In the weeks that followed, Vincent stopped running. He was still a man of few words, mind you, but when Catherine showed up, he didn't pull away. They started talking more. He told her all about the farm, the struggles of working alone, and his plans to expand the pasture land. She told him about her family's store, about the interesting folks who came in, and about the book she was reading that she borrowed from the school teacher. These were real conversations, not just words to fill the silence. And then the small gestures started. Catherine brought him food more often, always with a good excuse. There was too much bread left at the store, and it'd be a waste to throw it out. Her mother had made too much stew, and it would be a shame not to share. There were some sweets that didn't sell, and would he mind taking them? He started accepting with more and more gratitude, and soon he started to give back in his own way. He'd bring her fresh eggs from his chickens, or show up with a jar of wild honey he'd found in the woods. One time he brought her a bunch of wildflowers, a gesture so out of the blue it made her heart do a little flip. The whole village watched this going on with a mix of curiosity and scorn. The older women would shake their heads and say that Catherine was ruining herself. The men made ugly comments about Vincent not knowing his place. But the loudest one of them all was John Thatcher. The blacksmith's son had not taken her rejection well, and seeing Catherine take an interest in the most unsuitable man in the whole county felt like a personal insult. John started a quiet but nasty campaign to tear Vincent down. He spread stories, some of them old and stretched out of shape, and some he just made up right on the spot. He said Vincent had terrible fits of rage, that he busted things up when he got angry. He claimed that animals on his farm died in strange ways. He told people that Vincent scared off anyone who tried to work for him with his cruel ways. None of it was true, of course, but a rumor doesn't need truth to do its damage. Catherine heard all these stories, and every single one just made her more determined. She knew Vincent now, or at least she was getting to know him. She knew he was a gentleman underneath that hard, reserved. She knew he was an honest man who worked hard and took good care of his land and his animals. She knew he had been hurt sometime in his past and chose to protect himself instead of risking more pain. And she knew, with a certainty that grew every day, that she was falling in love with him. The whole thing came to a head one afternoon in late June. Catherine was working in the store when John walked in with two of his buddies. You could tell they had been drinking, even though it was only the middle of the afternoon. John swaggered up to the counter where Catherine was, leaned on it heavy, and started talking loud enough for the entire store to hear. He said it was a crying shame to see a pretty, talented girl like her wasting her time on a man who did not even know how to treat a lady. He said that Vincent Drummond was a savage, more like an animal than a person, living up in those hills all by himself like some lone wolf. He said Catherine was dirtying herself by being seen with him, that she was staining her family's good name, and that she ought to be ashamed for turning away decent men to chase after that creature. Catherine felt a hot rage boil up inside her. It was not just because he was insulting her. It was the terrible injustice of him saying those things about Vincent. She stood up straight, her eyes flashing with a dangerous light. Her voice was firm and cut right through the whispers of the other customers. She said that John ought to be the one who was ashamed, talking that way about a man who was worth 10 of him. She said Vincent was an honest, brave, and decent man, qualities John clearly knew nothing about. Possess. That if a soul there was acting like a wild animal, it was John, drunk and full of disrespect in the middle of the day. The whole store went dead quiet. John's face turned beet red, a mix of pure fury and shame, and he let loose a nasty word, the kind a gentleman ought never to use around a lady. Anthony Miller, who was back in the stockroom, heard the commotion and came hustling out. He ordered John to leave right then and there, saying he would not have that kind of talk in his place of business. John stumbled on his way out, but not before he threw a threat over his shoulder, sneering that Catherine would be mighty sorry for picking the wrong side. That evening felt heavy and long. Catherine could not shake the raw injustice of it all. Vincent was judged just for being different, and now she was catching heat for simply standing up for him. Mrs. Amelia tried to talk to her with genuine worry plain on her face. She asked if Catherine was certain about the path she was walking. She said it was not about Vincent himself, but that her daughter needed to think about the social price of tying herself to someone so on the outs with everyone. Catherine told her mother she understood her concern, but for the very first time she was letting her heart lead instead of worrying about what other people expected. She said that Vincent saw her, the real her, not just a pretty prize, and that she saw him as a good and complicated man, not the mean stories people told. If the town did not like it, well, that was the town's problem, not hers. Mrs. Amelia let out a long sigh, but did not push it anymore. She saw that familiar stubborn streak. It was the same one she had as a young woman, when she chose Anthony over the wishes of her own wealthy family. 2 days later, Vincent showed up in town. Catherine was helping arrange new stock when she heard someone call her name from the street. She stepped outside, and there was Vincent, looking more wound up than usual. He asked if they could have a word in private. Catherine agreed right away, and they walked around to the side of the store where there was a little patio. Vincent said he had heard about what happened with John Thatcher. News sure travels fast in a small town, somebody had told him. He looked troubled in a way she had never seen before. He said he never wanted to bring trouble to her door, and he would understand if she wanted to keep her distance. He promised he would not hold it against her, that maybe it was for the best, for her own sake. He said he was used to being alone anyway. Catherine felt a knot tighten in her chest. Vincent was trying to push her away to keep her safe, willing to give up the only real human connection he had made in years. It was so much like him, a gesture so noble and so deeply lonely. She took one step closer, closing the small space between them. She said that he did not get to make this choice for her, that she was a grown woman who could pick her own friends, and that she did not give a hoot about gossip or what folks might think. She told him that he mattered to her. Those last words came out softer, more open than she intended. Vincent stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on hers. Catherine could almost see the war raging inside him. It was there in the hard set of his shoulders and the clench of his jaw. Fear was wrestling with hope. The need to protect her was fighting the desire to be with her, and the safety of being alone was up against the risk of connection. At long last, with a slow, hesitant motion, Vincent reached out his hand. He was not offering it for a formal handshake, he was just offering it. Catherine knew exactly what it meant. It was an invitation. It was a confession. It was a surrender. She put her hand in his. She felt the warmth and the strength, and the slight tremble that told her just how much this simple act cost him. Vincent's voice was hoarse when he said he did not know how to do this, how to have someone in his life, how to be the man she deserved. Catherine gently squeezed his hand, smiling even as tears started to burn her eyes. She told him they would learn how to do it together, that he did not have to be perfect. He just had to be real. And he, more than anyone she had ever met, was completely and truly real. They just stood there, with their hands joined as the world kept turning around them. It was a small thing, a moment someone could easily miss in the blink of an eye. But for the two of them, it was everything. It was a decision. It was a promise. It was the start of something that would... It had changed them both, in ways they were just beginning to figure out. When they finally pulled apart, a new truth settled between them. They were not just town acquaintances. They were not simply friends. They had become something more, something that did not have a name yet, but felt as real as the solid ground under their boots. Vincent said he needed to get back to his farm. Catherine asked when she might see him again. A faint smile touched his lips, and it was enough to make her heart thump a little faster. He promised it would be soon, sooner than usual, and he was a man of his word. Vincent began showing up in town a whole lot more, and not just to buy supplies. Sometimes he would come just to see Catherine, and he would wait patiently outside the store for her to have a quiet moment. They would talk right there on the wooden porch as the slow life of the village drifted by. Folks watched, and they talked. But Catherine found she did not care one bit anymore. And Vincent, you could see he was slowly learning not to care either. Then there was the afternoon he saw her walking back from a delivery and offered her a ride. They rode along together, talking about everything and nothing at all. She told him about a book she was reading, a tale of grand adventures in faraway places. He listened with a genuine stillness, asking smart questions that showed he was truly hearing what she had to say. When they said their goodbye, a long silence stretched between them as their eyes locked, and Catherine thought for a sure second he was going to kiss her. He did not, but the feeling of what almost happened, just about as powerful. Like the morning she took fresh bread out to the farm and found Vincent busy fixing the shed roof. She stood there just watching, taking in how skilled his hands were, the solid strength in a body shaped by years of hard work. When he climbed down and spotted her, the smile that flashed across his face was quick, but it changed everything. It made him look a whole lot younger, like the loneliness hadn't left such a deep mark. Then there was that full moon night when she was closing up the store. He just showed up, said he saw the light was still on, and wanted to make sure she was all right. They just stood there in the doorway, washed in that silvery light, talking real soft so they wouldn't wake the neighbors. Vincent told her about the stars and how he used them to find his way when he had to travel after dark. Catherine told him about her mama and how she taught her to sew by the light of a lamp. They were just little pieces of themselves they were offering each other. And then there were the touches, always short, always proper, but happening more and more. Hands would brush when they passed something. Shoulders would bump when they walked together. One time, Catherine stumbled on a loose stone, and Vincent caught her right around the waist to steady her. They stayed that way for a second longer than was just an accident, close enough for Catherine to feel the warmth from his body, to see the little gold flecks in his brown eyes, and to notice how his gaze dropped to her lips for just a heartbeat before he looked away. Away. Anybody who was really looking could see the change in Vincent. He had not all of a sudden become a social butterfly, but his sharp edges were starting to soften. He would give other folks in the village a quick nod. He did not run from small talk anymore. He even helped Mr. Boniface carry some heavy sacks one time. It was a simple thing, but it sure surprised the old man, who had always kept his distance. Catherine knew it was because Vincent was starting to remember that not everyone was cruel, that there was some kindness in the world if you just let it in. But the folks against him had not gone anywhere. John Thatcher especially was getting more and more sour. He would make sharp comments whenever he saw Catherine and glare at Vincent with a hatred he hardly tried to hide. One afternoon he stood right in Vincent's way at the warehouse entrance, making some remark about how some men just do not know their place. Vincent did not say a word, just turned right around and walked off. But Catherine, who saw the whole thing, marched straight up to John. She told him he was acting pathetic and that he ought to worry about his own life instead of being so bitter about hers. The whole thing came to a head one afternoon in July. Catherine was walking home from a friend's house when John turned up, clearly drunk again. He started backing her into a corner with his words, saying nasty things about how she was throwing herself away and how she was too blind to see that Vincent would never be a good enough man, and that the whole village was laughing at her. Catherine tried to get past him, but John grabbed her arm. It was not violent, but it was a drunk man's stubborn grip. That is right when Vincent appeared. He was coming from the other way, probably heading back from some business. He saw what was happening, and his whole demeanor changed. He crossed the street in 3 long steps, and he grabbed John's wrist with a force that made the younger man let go of Catherine right away and yelp in pain. Vincent spoke in a low voice, but it was filled with a threat Catherine had never heard before. He said that John would never touch her again, never speak to her again, and never even look in her direction again. He said if he did, Vincent himself would make sure he lived to regret it. There was a coiled power in him, not some empty threat, but the absolute certainty of a man who knew exactly how to use his strength when he had to. John went pale, mumbled some apologies, and stumbled away. Catherine just stood there, her heart pounding, not from being scared, but from something a whole lot more complicated. Vincent turned to her, the anger in his eyes replaced by concern. He asked if she was all right, if John had hurt her. She said she was fine, that he got there just in time, and she thanked him. Vincent just shook his head and said there was no need for thanks, that protecting her was. He stopped right there and did not finish the sentence. But he did not have to. Catherine understood. Protecting her was just instinct to him, a need, something he would do without a second thought. They walked to her house together. The sun was setting, painting the whole sky with shades of orange and purple. They stopped out in front of the store, both of them a little hesitant. You could feel something in the air, a kind of electricity that had been building for weeks and was finally about to spark. Vincent said he did not like the idea of John or anyone else bothering her. Catherine answered that he could not always be there to protect her. Vincent was quiet for a minute, then he said, real careful, like he was weighing every single word, that he wished he could be. Catherine felt her breath catch in her throat. She looked up and met his eyes. Vincent kept going, his voice low but steady. He said he did not know when it all happened, that he tried to fight it because he thought it would be better for her, but he just could not deny it anymore. That she had become too important to him. That he thought about her all the time, that the farm, which used to be his safe place, now just felt empty when he came home alone. That he felt something for her he had never felt for anyone before. It was not some flowery speech. There were no fancy words or big promises. It was just the plain, honest truth from a man who did not know how to lie or dress things up. And that is exactly what made it perfect. Catherine felt tears start to sting her eyes, but they were happy tears. She said she felt it too. That she had been feeling it for a while, maybe ever since he rescued her, or maybe since she first saw the real kindness in him, when everyone else just saw a hard man. Vincent raised his hand, a little unsure, and with a touch as light as a feather he brushed her cheek. The gesture felt so gentle, so full of respect, especially coming from those strong, calloused hands. He said she deserved a whole lot more than he could ever give her, but if she wanted him, if she truly wanted him, he would try. He would try to be the man she needed. He would try to be worthy of her. Catherine pressed his hand against her face and said he already was, that he did not need to be anything other than the man he was right then. And then finally, under that sky painted with all the colors of dusk, Vincent leaned down and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, almost timid, his lips pressing against hers carefully, as if he thought she might break. Catherine kissed him back, her hands moving up to his broad shoulders, making the kiss just a little deeper. Vincent made a low sound in his throat and wrapped one arm around her, pulling her in closer. The kiss stayed gentle, but it held a promise in it, a promise of more, of a future, of everything they had both been looking for, without even knowing it was missing. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing a little faster. Vincent rested his forehead against hers with his eyes closed. He said he did not know how this was all going to work, how they would manage with the whole town against them. Catherine replied, "We will find a way. When two people truly care about each other, the rest is just details." Vincent smiled, a real full smile that lit up his entire face. He said she made everything seem possible. They stayed like that for a few more moments before Catherine knew she had to go inside. Her parents were probably getting worried. Vincent walked her to the door. He said goodbye with a promise to see her soon, but they both knew something important had just changed. They were not just two people anymore trying to figure out a connection that did not make sense to anyone else. They were something new, something fragile but real, and something worth protecting. Inside the house, Miss Amelia and Anthony were waiting. They saw their daughter's face, the light in her eyes, and they knew. Amelia let out a sigh, but then she smiled. She asked if Catherine was sure. Catherine said she was more sure of this than anything in her entire life. Anthony watched her for a long moment, and then he nodded. He said Vincent seemed like an honorable man, and if he made his daughter happy, then he had his blessing. But he added that their road was not going to be easy, that it would take the village a long time to accept it. Catherine said she did not care, that she had learned that what other people think is not worth a thing compared to the truth you feel in your own heart. That night, lying in her bed, Catherine could hardly sleep. Her whole body was still humming with the memory of that kiss, of Vincent's strong arms, of the feeling of finally being in the right place. She thought about how strange life could be. Just a few months ago, she was tired of turning down one suitor after another, thinking she would never find a real connection. And then a storm rolled in, a wagon flipped over, and the one man everyone else avoided became her hero in more ways than just saving her life. Vincent had not only saved her from the creek, but he had also shown her the kind of love that was worth waiting for. A love that was built on what you do, not just what you say. A love that saw past the surface. A love built on the solid ground of respect and looking up to each other. True love, the kind that is rare and precious. And somewhere up in the hills at Wild Ridge Farm, Vincent was not sleeping either. He stared up at the dark ceiling of the quiet house that had been his own private prison for years, and for the first time in so long, he felt hope. Catherine Miller, the most admired woman in town, had chosen him, not in spite of who he was, but because of it. She saw right through the reputation people had given him and found the real man underneath. And that man, much to his surprise, was worthy of being loved. Their journey was not over. In fact, it was just getting started. But they both knew with a quiet certainty that every hard thing they faced would be worth it, because true love always is. The months that came after that first kiss were all about discovery and growing. Catherine and Vincent built their relationship their own way, paying no mind to the town's unwritten rules that other couples seemed to follow like scripture. There were no nosy chaperones on their visits, no stiff and formal courtship that fit some old-fashioned mold. What they had was something real. Vincent came down from the ridge to the village more often. When he did, he would spend hours just talking with Catherine on the store's front porch. Or they would walk through the streets as the sun bled across the sky. He took her out to see Wild Ridge Farm properly, showing her the pastures where his cattle grazed lazily. He pointed out the crystal-clear creek that carved its way through the property, and the breathtaking view from the top of the hill that gave the place its name. Catherine saw the quiet pride shining in his eyes when he showed her the fences he had fixed, the fields he had brought back to life, and all the improvements he had made on his own over the years. She came to understand that Vincent spoke through his hard work. Every sturdy fence was a statement about his character, and every healthy animal was a testament to his dedication. In turn, Catherine brought him into her world. Vincent started staying for supper at the Miller's house. At first, he was a little awkward and uncomfortable, but he gradually eased up under the warmth of Mrs. Amelia's hospitality and the quiet talks with Anthony. They discovered that Vincent had a deep well of knowledge about raising cattle that even impressed Anthony, who had been dealing with ranchers for decades. They found out he had a dry sense of humor that would show up at the most unexpected times, making everyone at the table laugh. They learned that underneath that reserved exterior was a complicated and a mighty interesting man at that. But folks in St. Sebastian's Valley just were not ready to see that match. The disapproval began as hushed whispers and soon turned into plain-spoken judgment. The women of the village, particularly the older ones, thought it was an absolute scandal. Catherine Miller, the pride of their community, was throwing her life away on a man who was not her equal. They said she had been put under some kind of spell, that she was not thinking with a clear head. that her gratitude for the rescue had clouded her mind. They gossiped that Vincent had taken advantage and manipulated a simple girl, that he had other darker reasons for his interest. The men were even worse, seeing Vincent as some outsider who had managed to get what none of them could. John Thatcher was the loudest of the bunch, spreading his poison any chance he got. He cooked up stories about Vincent having a violent temper, about him hiding terrible secrets out on that farm. He claimed Catherine would wake up one day and see her mistake, but by then it would be far too late. That campaign to ruin his name was constant and ugly. There was a bad run-in back in August. Vincent was in the general store getting supplies when a knot of men with John right in the middle of them came in. They made a big show of talking loud about how some fellas just did not understand when they were not welcome, how some people did not have the good sense to stay where they belonged. Vincent paid them no mind at all, finished his shopping with that steady calm of his, and walked out without giving them the satisfaction. But Catherine saw the tightness in his shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. It took every ounce of grit he had to keep that composure. She tried to soothe him later, telling him that the opinions of those people did not mean a thing. Vincent agreed with the idea, but she could tell it stung him more than he let on. Not because he had any doubts about himself, but because he was worried it would eventually start to wear on Catherine. He told her he did not want her to be cast out on his account, that maybe they ought to be more low-key about things. Catherine flat out refused, saying she would not hide and she was not the least bit ashamed of how they felt for each other. She argued that the more they reacted to the gossip, the more power they handed over to it. It was a courageous stand, but it came with a price. A few customers started taking their business elsewhere when they knew Catherine was working. The invitations for social get-togethers with the other young women in the village just stopped showing up. One family even made it perfectly clear they did not approve, saying Catherine was setting a poor example. Mrs. Amelia heard in silence, not because she was against her daughter's choice, but because she saw her child getting hurt by the cruelty of others. But for every person who turned away, there were others who gave their quiet support. Mrs. Lucinda, an old friend of the family, said right out loud that Vincent seemed like a fine man, and that Catherine was doing right by following her heart. Mr. Boniface mentioned he had always figured the stories about Vincent were overblown, that a hard-working and decent young fella deserved a fair shake. Even the town priest, a wise man. He told her about everyone in the town, mentioned in a church sermon that people should not judge what they do not understand, that looks can be deceiving, and that kindness can be found in the most unlikely of places. The bond between Catherine and Vincent grew deeper, no matter what anyone on the outside thought. They knew the real each other now, far beyond first impressions, and that first spark of attraction. Catherine learned that Vincent loved to read, that he kept a small shelf of books on his farm that he would read over and over on lonely nights. He learned that she dreamed of traveling one day, of seeing the ocean and places beyond their mountains. She learned that he played the harmonica, an instrument his father had taught him, though he almost never played it for anyone else. He learned that she painted with watercolors when she found the time. She painted little landscapes that she kept hidden because she was shy about them. They shared their private fears, too. Catherine confessed that she sometimes doubted herself, that after years of being seen only for her looks, she worried if she had anything else to give. Vincent told her with absolute certainty that she was the most interesting person he knew, that her beauty was just a small thing compared to her smarts, her kindness, and her courage. Vincent admitted he was scared he would eventually let her down, that she would wake up one morning and realize she had made a terrible mistake in choosing him. Catherine took his face in her hands and said the only way he could ever let her down was if he gave up on them. She told him she chose him for exactly who he was, and that choice was as solid as a rock. Their kisses started happening more often and with more passion. They were still proper and respectful of the boundaries of the time, but they were filled with a growing desire and the promise of a shared future. There were afternoons out at the farm where they would stand wrapped in each other's arms under the shade of a massive old oak tree, talking about their plans. Vincent mentioned very carefully that the main house could be added on to, that there was plenty of room to build more rooms. Catherine knew what he was really asking without him having to say the words. She smiled and said that she had always been fond of houses with big porches, where a person could sit and watch the sunset. It was a strange courtship by the town's standards, but it was theirs. It was real and honest, built on a strong foundation of respect and true love. And they both knew it was heading toward something permanent. Vincent had not made a formal proposal yet, but it was just a matter of time. He wanted to be sure that everything was just right, that he could give her the kind of life she deserved. It was in September when everything came to a head. The village held a dance every year, a big spring celebration that the whole community attended. Catherine usually went, more because she was expected to than because she wanted to. This year, she asked Vincent if he would go with her. He hesitated, and she could see the uncertainty on his face. He was not a man for big parties, and he hated being in the middle of a crowd, model folks. But he looked at Catherine, saw the hope shining in her eyes, and he agreed. Well, the news that Vincent Drummond was fixin' to show up at the ball spread like a prairie fire. The tension in the days before was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Some folks said it was bound to be a disaster, that a fight was sure to break out. Others were just plain curious, wanted to see it all go down. John Thatcher and his buddies made some sideways comments about how some people had a lot of nerve showing their faces where they weren't wanted. The night of the ball finally rolled around. Catherine put on her finest dress, a soft blue that made her eyes sparkle. Mrs. Amelia helped her pin up her hair, letting a few curls hang loose to frame her face. When Vincent came to get her, he looked mighty uncomfortable in clothes fancier than he was used to. But he was there. He had come for her, facing a whole mess of trouble he clearly despised, all because it meant something to her. They walked into that hall together. For a second, the music just stopped. Every conversation died down. Every single head turned their way. It was a moment so dramatic it couldn't have been planned. But it was real. Vincent and Catherine standing there together, quietly daring everyone to judge them. Then the music started back up. The chatter resumed, but quieter now, with everyone watching out of the corner of their eye. Vincent stood stiff as a board next to Catherine, clearly a fish out of water. She gave his hand a little squeeze and whispered that everything was all right. They didn't have to stay all night. They got themselves a drink and stood off to the side of the room just watching the other folks dance. A few people came over to say hello to Catherine, acting like Vincent was invisible. Most just steered clear of them altogether. It was Mrs. Lucinda who finally broke the ice. That old woman marched right on over to them, greeted Vincent with a warm smile, and thanked him for taking such fine care of Catherine. She said it did her heart good to see a young and loving couple. Her say-so mattered a whole lot in that town. A few other older, respected folks followed her lead. Before you knew it, a small group was talking with them, and Vincent, though still looking uneasy, answered their questions politely. Then the band struck up a waltz. Catherine looked up at Vincent with hopeful eyes. He just shook his head a little and said he didn't know how to dance. She smiled and told him she'd teach him. He hesitated for a moment, but he couldn't tell her no. They walked out to the middle of the floor, and Catherine gently led the way. Vincent was clumsy at first, nearly tripping over his own boots, but he had a natural rhythm that soon found the music. They danced, and as they did, Catherine saw the whole world just fade away in his eyes. In that moment, it was just the two of them. John Thatcher watched from across the room, his face twisted up with anger and jealousy. He just kept drinking, surrounded by his friends who were egging him on. When the song ended, Vincent and Catherine stepped out onto the porch for some fresh air, and John saw his chance. He followed them, stumbling. Just a little bit. Catherine saw him first, and the look on his face made her stomach knot up. Vincent felt her tense up and turned around. John stopped a few feet away, his eyes glassy, fixed on Vincent. He said, his voice slurred from the liquor, that it was real brave of Vincent to show his face here, to pretend he was welcome, to act like he was good enough for someone like Catherine. Vincent didn't say a word, just moved to stand a little bit in front of Catherine. John kept on, the poison just pouring out of him now. He said, everyone knows the truth, that you're nothing, got nothing to offer her. Catherine will wake up one day and realize she wasted her best years on you, and it'll be too late. She deserves someone better, someone with a future, someone who can give her the kind of life she's supposed to have. Now, if this story about true love standing tall against all odds moves your heart, go on and leave a like so more folks can hear this powerful ending. Catherine took a step forward, ready to defend Vincent like she always did, but he stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. For the first time since he'd known John, Vincent spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of years of silence finally being broken. He said John was right about one thing. Catherine did deserve better. She deserved a man who saw her for who she really was, not just for her pretty face. She deserved to be loved for her kindness, her smarts, her courage, not for a beauty that other men wanted to own like property. He cleared his throat. He said she deserved someone who would choose her every single day, not because it was easy or looked good, but because a life without her would be nothing but an empty shell. Vincent went on, his eyes locked on John, but his words were clearly meant for the growing crowd that was listening in. He said he couldn't offer her riches or a high standing in town. He couldn't promise her a life without hardship or that everyone would approve. But what he could offer was total honesty. He could offer a loyalty that would never break. He could offer a love built on a solid foundation of respect and real admiration. He offered a life where she would be his partner, not some prize on his arm. A life where her thoughts would matter, where her dreams would be cheered on, where she would be free to be exactly the woman she was meant to be. And then Vincent turned to Catherine, ignoring John and everyone else completely. The look on his face had changed. It was a mix of vulnerability and strength that touched her deep in her soul. He told her he had spent 8 long years believing he didn't deserve to be close to anyone. That being alone was all he had to look forward to. But then she came into his life like a whirlwind, both literally and figuratively, and turned everything upside down. Vincent said she showed him he wasn't broken, just waiting for someone who understood his language. That she saw right through the lies people told about him and found the real man underneath. That she was brave when it would have been a whole lot easier to just go along with the crowd. That she chose him over and over again, no matter what stood in their way. And that was the most precious gift he had ever received in his whole life. He took her hand, and right there, under the watching eyes of half the town, he knelt down. The silence that fell over the porch was absolute. Vincent pulled a simple ring from his pocket, made of worked gold that had clearly been shaped by hand. He said it wasn't a fancy ring like she deserved, but he had forged it himself, working the metal on his anvil until it was perfect, pouring all the care and dedication he felt for her right into it. Vincent asked if Catherine would accept him as her husband. He said he couldn't promise a life without troubles, but he could promise a love without limits. He promised to be her loyal partner, her faithful companion, and her safe harbor in every storm. He promised to see her, to really see her every single day. He promised to honor her, respect her, and love her until his last breath. And he promised to spend the rest of his life proving that she didn't make a mistake by choosing him. Tears were just streaming down Catherine's face. Her heart felt so full she thought it might burst. She looked at that man, the rough rancher everyone was afraid of, kneeling there so vulnerable before her, offering her everything he was with such raw honesty. And she knew without a single doubt that it was the most beautiful proposal she could ever receive in 1,000 lifetimes. She said yes. Then she said it again, louder, so everyone could hear. Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes. Vincent slid the ring onto her finger, his own hands shaking just a little, before he stood and pulled her into a solid embrace. Catherine held on tight, a mess of happy tears and laughter all at once. The entire hall erupted with all kinds of noise. Some folks clapped, genuinely moved by what they had just seen. Others just stared, completely shocked and scandalized. John Thatcher's face went beet red before he turned on his heel and stomped right out of there. But Catherine didn't pay any of that no mind. Vincent held her like she was the most precious thing in the whole world, and she held him right back, grounding him in a place that had tried for so long to push him out. When they finally pulled back enough to see each other, Vincent gently wiped away her tears. He asked if she was really sure, if she wouldn't come to regret this. She laughed through her tears and told him she had never been more certain of anything in her life. They left that party not long after, not because they were thrown out or running away, but simply because they no longer needed to be there. They had found everything that mattered right there in each other. They walked side by side through the quiet village streets, their hands locked together, already making plans for a future that was now solid, instead of just a hopeful dream. Vincent spoke of adding on to the house and building that big porch she always wanted. Catherine talked about planting a flower garden to finally have a place to grow all the blossoms she loved. He suggested that maybe one day they could travel and see the ocean she had always dreamed of seeing. She told him any place on earth would be perfect, just as long as they were there together. Their plans were simple, but they were filled with promise and a world of possibilities. The wedding preparations happened fast. Neither of them wanted some big, fancy to-do or a long wait. They set the date for October, just 6 weeks away. It was going to be a small ceremony with just their closest family and a few true friends. Vincent didn't have any family of his own, but the Millers had taken him in like a son. Anthony gave his official blessing, saying he saw the things that truly mattered in Vincent: his honesty, his capacity for hard work, and his devotion to his daughter. The village stayed split down the middle. Some folks thought it was the most romantic thing they had ever heard, a real-life love story that had beaten the odds. Others kept shaking their heads, whispering that Catherine was making a terrible mistake she would live to regret. John Thatcher was gone for a few weeks, hiding out from the shame of being so publicly rejected. When he finally came back, he was mighty careful to avoid any place where he might run into Vincent or Catherine. The ceremony took place on a crisp October morning, under a sky so blue it didn't have a single cloud. The church was only about half full, holding just the people who truly supported their union. Catherine wore a simple but lovely dress her mother had helped her sew. Vincent was in a suit that was obviously brand new and a bit stiff, but he stood there with his eyes locked on his bride like she was a walking miracle. When the preacher asked Vincent if he took Catherine to be his wife, his voice was strong and clear. "I do, with all my heart." When it was Catherine's turn, she smiled through her happy tears and said, "I do, forever and always." They exchanged plain wedding bands and sealed their promises with a kiss that made all the women sigh, and even brought a little moisture to some of the men's eyes. And just like that, they were husband and wife, Vincent and Catherine Drummond. The celebration at the Miller's house was small but full of joy, with plenty of good food and soft music playing. Catherine had never seen Vincent so relaxed. He was laughing at Anthony's stories and accepting good wishes with a newfound ease. She was watching him transform right before her very eyes. He wasn't turning into someone else, but he was finally letting the man he had always been on the inside show himself without any fear. As the sun began to set, they left for Wild Ridge Farm. Vincent helped Catherine onto the wagon seat and then climbed up right beside her. As they pulled away from the village, Catherine took one last look back, not with any sadness or regret, but with the feeling of closing a book. That old life where people admired her but never understood her, where her beauty was both a gift and a burden, where she always felt like she was on display but never truly seen, was over. A brand new life was starting, one she had chosen with her eyes wide open and a heart that was sure. The farm greeted them with the last golden rays of sunlight. Vincent had worked for weeks to get everything just right. The house was spotless and tidy, with wildflowers stuck in makeshift vases, and a fire already light in the fireplace to chase away the night's chill. Catherine walked through the rooms, seeing the little touches he had added. There were new curtains on the windows, a new rug in the living room, and even a small bookshelf he had built just for her books. She turned to him, a fresh wave of emotion making her eyes burn. Vincent was leaning against the doorframe, just watching her with a soft look on his face. He said he wanted her to feel at home, that this place was theirs now, not just his. Catherine crossed the room to him, wrapped her arms around his neck and said, "Home wasn't a place, it was a person." And he was her home now, no matter where they were. That first night, as man and wife, was quiet and precious. Vincent was gentle and careful and attentive, treating her with a reverence that moved her to her core. Catherine gave herself to him completely, without any hesitation, trusting him with everything she had. And when they finally fell asleep, tangled up together under the warm blankets, they both felt a deep sense of peace, of being whole, as if all the scattered pieces of their lives had finally clicked into place. The months that followed were full of learning and discovery. Catherine learned the rhythms of the ranch, the daily chores of caring for the animals, the seasons of planting and harvest. It was not an easy life. It took hard work every single day, but she loved it. There was a freedom out there she had never known in town. She could wake up with the sun and watch the sunrise without worrying about who might see her. She could work in her garden with dirt under her nails without anyone judging her. She could just be herself. Vincent thrived, too. With Catherine by his side, the loneliness he had carried for so many years just melted away. The house that had always been too quiet was now filled with laughter and music. He found joy again in the little things like sharing breakfast, talking about the day's plans, or swapping stories by the fire at night. Catherine taught him how to dance in the kitchen where there was no one to watch and critique, just the two of them, moving clumsily but happily. He would play his harmonica for her, sad and beautiful tunes his father had taught him. She painted watercolors of the ranch, capturing the beauty she saw all around her. They went into the village every now and then, always together. The way people treated them got better over time. Folks saw that their marriage was solid, that Catherine was truly happy. Some who had been the most critical had to admit that maybe they'd been wrong. The rest just got used to the new reality. John Thatcher eventually married a girl from the next town over and stopped bothering them. Life went on, and Vincent and Catherine became just another married couple, not the town scandal. But out on that ranch, far from prying eyes, they built something truly special. It wasn't just a marriage, it was a real partnership. When there were decisions to be made about the land, Vincent would ask for Catherine's opinion, and he truly listened to what she had to say. When she had ideas for how to improve things, he would help her make them happen. They worked together in the fields, they took care of the livestock as a team, and they faced every problem that came their way as one. A terrible storm came through one year and tore off part of the shed roof, and they worked for days under a hot sun to fix it. A brutal winter took some of their cattle, and they mourned the loss together before moving on. A long drought tested their spirits, but they rationed water, changed their plans, and got through it. With every challenge they overcame, they grew stronger and closer. And there were plenty of joys, too. There was the first big harvest after Catherine helped figure out a new way to lay out the fields. There was the day Vincent finally finished that big porch he had promised, and they spent the whole night just sitting out there watching the stars and talking about their dreams. There was the morning Catherine woke up and realized that she was completely and perfectly happy, with no second thoughts or doubts. And there was the evening Vincent held her close and whispered that she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and that he did not know how he had ever lived so long without her. The years went by, not too fast and not too slow. They just rolled on, with each day bringing its own mix of hard work, new challenges, small comforts, and a steady, constant love. Vincent and Catherine grew older together, not in some dramatic way, but in all the little ways. A few more smile lines appeared around her eyes. A few strands of silver showed up at his temples, and their hands grew more calloused from work, but they were still always reaching for each other. The farm flourished under their shared care. They slowly expanded, buying up the land next to theirs and growing their herd. The house got a few more rooms, just like Vincent had planned. Catherine's garden bloomed into a riot of color that you could see all the way from the main road. Sometimes travelers passing through would remark on how beautiful the place was, on the feeling of peace that seemed to radiate from Wild Ridge Farm. The village changed over time as well. New generations grew up who did not remember the old ways of thinking. To the younger folks, Vincent and Catherine were just that couple who lived on the farm up in the hills, known for being kind to strangers and having a marriage as solid as an oak. The old days of being judged and left out were forgotten by nearly everyone, except the two people who had lived through them. 4 years after their wedding, on a particularly lovely spring morning, Catherine and Vincent were sitting on the porch he had built. Their coffee had gone cold in their cups, forgotten as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. A soft breeze drifted by, carrying the sweet smell of the flowers from her garden and freshly cut grass. It was one of those perfect moments, simple and ordinary, but precious because of it. Vincent had his arm around Catherine's shoulders, and she was leaning her head against his chest. He spoke in a low, contented voice, saying he never imagined life could be like this. So simple, but so whole. So quiet, but so full. Catherine just smiled. Agreed, saying that the very storm that nearly took her life was the thing that actually saved it, because it brought her to him. Vincent kissed the crown of her head, a sweet gesture of affection that had become second nature over the years. He said that every single choice he had ever made, every hardship he had ever faced, was worth it, because it all led to this moment, to this life, and to this woman he was holding. Catherine tilted her face up to meet his eyes. Even after all their years together, there was always that spark of recognition, that little flame that would light up whenever they truly looked at one another. She told him that he had changed everything for her. She said that before him, she had been lost in a world of shallow praise, slowly sinking without even knowing it. She said that he saw the real her when she felt invisible, and he valued her when everyone else just saw a pretty face. He had given her not just his love, but the freedom to be her true self. She said theirs was the most beautiful love story of all, because it was real, built on truth and respect, and the choice they made every single day to put each other first. Vincent had never been a man of many words, but he spoke with a deep conviction that came straight from his soul, saying that she was his whole world, that she had turned an empty farmhouse into a home brimming with life, that she had turned a closed-off, wounded man into someone who could love without being afraid. He said that every single day with her was a gift, every night was a blessing, and that he would spend the rest of forever being thankful to fate, or to God, or to whatever power had turned that wagon over in the storm and set her right in his path. They stayed just like that for a good long while as the sun climbed higher, washing everything in a golden glow. They were two people who could not have been more different, but had found each other against all odds. The rugged farmer the world had judged so wrongly, and the kind-hearted woman the world had admired for all the wrong reasons. Together they had found something that countless people search for their entire lives and never find: true love, the deep and life-changing kind. It was not some storybook romance where everything was perfect from the get-go. It was better than that. It was a real story, with its own set of trials and troubles, with hard work and moments of doubt. But it was a story where two people chose each other again and again, where their love grew and deepened and got stronger with time and with every challenge they faced. It was a story about courage. It was about Catherine's courage to defy what everyone expected of her, to follow what her heart wanted instead of what society said was proper. It was about Vincent's courage to open his heart again, to trust someone after being hurt, and to believe that he was worthy of being loved. It was about the courage they both had to build a life on their own terms, paying no mind to the critics and the doubters. It was a story about transformation. Vincent, who had spent years thinking loneliness was his fate, changed into a devoted husband and a loving partner. Catherine, who had spent a lifetime being admired for things that did not matter, transformed into a whole and happy woman, seen and loved for the person she truly was. But more than anything, it was a story about recognition. It was about two souls who, by a stroke of unbelievable luck, saw in each other what they had been searching for without even knowing it. In Catherine, Vincent saw a genuine kindness, a quiet bravery, and the ability to see past the rough exterior. In Vincent, Catherine saw a fierce honesty, a silent strength, and a loyal heart that was hidden away under the armor of past hurts. And when they finally found each other, when they truly saw each other, there was nothing else they could do but love. Not with a shallow love based on looks or what was convenient, but with a deep love founded on mutual respect, true admiration, and the deliberate choice to walk through life side by side. Years down the road, when folks in the village would tell stories about the famous couples from the area, they always brought up Vincent and Catherine Drummond. They would talk about the dramatic rescue during the storm, about the unlikely romance that had faced down so much disapproval, and about the marriage that everyone swore would fail but instead flourished. It turned into a local legend, a tale that parents told their children about the importance of looking past the surface, about having the nerve to follow your heart, and about the value of real love. But for Vincent and Catherine, it was no legend. It was quite simply their life. And what a life it was. Full of hard work, to be sure, but also full of laughter. Their life was a tapestry woven with tough times, for sure, but also with tiny, precious victories. It was filled with ordinary days that became extraordinary just because they were together. They would grow old on that mountain farm, watching the seasons turn hundreds of times over. Every spring would bring a fresh start, every summer a time of plenty, every fall a good harvest, and every winter a time for well-deserved rest. Through it all, they would be each other's constant companion, their unshakable love, their true partner. Because when you got right down to it, that was the most beautiful love story of all. Not because it was easy or perfect, but because it was real, because they chose it. Because two people, each carrying their own scars and dreams, found a home and healing in one another. Vincent Drummond, the hard-nosed, solitary rancher everyone steered clear of, found warmth and a place to belong in Catherine's arms. Catherine Miller, the woman with a kind word for everyone but who nobody truly knew, finally found someone who saw her clear down to her soul and cherished everything he saw. And together, against all the odds, against the whispers and the outright objections, they built something that would last longer than their own lifetimes, a legacy not of money or status, but of genuine love, proving that when the right two people find each other, nothing else matters. Not a reputation, not what things look like, not what other folks think, just love, the real deep kind that changes you forever. And that was more than enough. That was everything.